Hello, welcome to A Book a Day. Today, the book we will discuss is called Amazing Me, with the subtitle Psychology of Self-Development. At first glance, the title may sound a bit academic, but in fact, the book addresses a question that concerns us all. How can we become better versions of ourselves? The author is a psychological counselor with over 10 years of experience in the field. In his professional career, he has received more than 6,000 visitors, all with one core desire: to improve themselves. Therefore, the author drew on his knowledge of psychology and these cases to write this book, hoping to help more people become better. In the book, the author compares the journey of self-improvement to a hero's journey, which goes through 3 stages: departure, enlightenment, and return. What do these stages represent? Firstly, the departure stage is like the beginning of a hero's story, where they often encounter critical turning points and even danger. Similarly, at each stage of our lives, we face different challenges and transitions. For example, during adolescence, we face the challenge of becoming an adult. In early adulthood, we may encounter difficulties with intimate relationships or career development. In middle age, we may experience a midlife crisis. Even in old age, we still face ultimate challenges such as death. However, no matter what, heroes and we ourselves will overcome our fears and bravely face these challenges on our journeys towards self-improvement. Next comes the enlightenment stage, which is the key stage for growth. From the moment we decide to embark on this hero's journey, we must step out of our comfort zones. Our previous habits and thought patterns may no longer be helpful, so we must master new behaviors and ways of thinking. Fortunately, on this journey, heroes usually encounter a special guardian, like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings or Dumbledore in Harry Potter, who gives guidance and protection. We also have our guardians, who may sometimes be admirable role models, and other times may be books like the one we're discussing today, which act as protectors. After accumulating these energies, heroes must begin to face enemies or monsters. We also need to confront the challenges of life, and this process may be difficult and lengthy, but the rewards we reap from it are unexpected. Finally, the hero completes their mission and shares what they have learned on their journey with those who are about to embark on their own journeys. Thus, the essence of a hero's story is not fighting or heroic acts, but rather the journey of self-discovery and self-transformation that we all go through. Although each of us has our own reasons for embarking on this journey, change exists in every behavior, thought, and relationship. Behavior is the external manifestation of the self, while thinking is the internal manifestation. Our behavior and thinking are largely shaped by our relationships. Therefore, I will gradually delve deeper into how to become a better version of ourselves from 3 aspects: behavior, thinking, and relationships, starting from the individual and expanding to relationships. Okay, let's first take a look at how to initiate behavior change. We know that wanting to improve oneself is easier said than done. Many times we make resolutions but fail to follow through. A medical survey showed that even if a heart specialist warns a severely ill patient about the risks of unhealthy lifestyle habits such as unhealthy diet, lack of exercise, and smoking, only 1 in 7 people will truly change their habits, despite the possibility of imminent danger to their lives. For the other 6 people who also want to live, they know what they need to do but are unable to change. Why is change so difficult? To answer this question, we first need to understand what change is. The author says that the essence of behavioral change is to use new experiences to replace old ones. The reason why change is difficult is that old experiences are too firmly entrenched and it's not easy to step out of our psychological comfort zone. At first glance, this seems like a cliché. The psychological comfort zone is supposed to be a comfortable and familiar environment, and it's natural that it's hard to leave such an environment. For example, someone who has found a stable and comfortable job in their hometown may not have much sense of achievement, but they prefer comfort. Over time, they don't want to face difficulties and challenge themselves. And this is easy to understand. But is that really the case? Not entirely. For example, the psychological comfort zone doesn't necessarily mean a comfortable living environment. In the movie The Shawshank Redemption, the character Brooks, who's about to be released after serving 50 years in prison, not only doesn't feel happy but even resorts to murder in order to continue serving his sentence in prison. You see, prison is not comfortable, but it is Brooks' psychological comfort zone. Similarly, leaving a familiar environment doesn't necessarily mean leaving our psychological comfort zone. Some people experience a complete transformation after changing their location or job, but many people have not changed much. So what does it mean to step out of our psychological comfort zone? The author tells us that it's only by changing our way of dealing with things that we can truly step out of our psychological comfort zone. So how do we do that? First, we can use the baby steps principle to take the first step towards change. That is, Take a small step on the road to change, starting from the smallest amount, and achieve a small success. By constantly achieving small successes and accumulating experience, we can provide psychological impetus for the next step, making change easier. For example, the Alcoholics Anonymous organization may be one of the most successful organizations in the world in helping people change. Every year, 2.1 million people seek help from them, and up to 10 million people successfully quit drinking. What did the Alcoholics Anonymous do? They have a famous 12-step program. The first step of this program is to admit that we are powerless over alcohol. What does that mean? It means acknowledging that we have lost control. This way, we don't have to focus on things we can't control. Then, the Alcoholics Anonymous uses the baby steps principle and asks members to set a one-day-at-a-time rule, which means not committing to quitting alcohol forever, but just committing to not drinking for 24 hours. What about after 24 hours? That's a new day, and we can set new goals for ourselves. By using the baby steps principle, many people have overcome their drinking problems. Therefore, the key point of the small steps principle is not the result, but the action at this moment and place. Focus on the small step you can take in front of you and do it well. The principle sounds simple, but its power is great. There is a story about an old monk and a young monk who went down the mountain to beg for food. When they returned to the foot of the mountain, it was already dark. The young monk looked ahead and asked the old monk worriedly, "Master, it's so dark, the road is so long, and there are cliffs and monsters on the mountain. We only have this small lantern. How can we get back home?" The old monk looked at him and calmly said 3 words. "Look at your feet." Looking at your feet is common sense, but that's how change happens. If you worry about the rugged mountain roads and the fierce flood beasts, you won't dare to take a step forward. If you just remind yourself to focus on your feet, one day you may look back and find that you have walked far. We know that small steps can bring big changes, but sometimes, even if people successfully take the first step towards change, they are still likely to give up halfway. So how can we solidify new experiences into long-lasting habits and not fall back into the comfort zone full of temptations? We can use the power of the environmental field. This environmental field is not some mysterious cosmic energy, but rather an environment that contains a large number of behavioral cues. These behavioral cues can stimulate specific behaviors. In other words, different environments can trigger different behaviors in us. For example, when we are at work, we chat and joke with each other in the tea room and canteen, but once we enter the office, we become serious and focused. So, as you can see, we humans are environment animals. Different environments can stimulate different psychological states, which in turn can lead to different behaviors. Knowing this, we can proactively use this to our advantage, using different environments to give ourselves different psychological cues, and letting ourselves change in subtle ways. The book gives an example from the author's own experience. He wrote this book in the study room of the Zhejiang Provincial Library. Even though he had a study room at home, and as a psychological counselor, he didn't have to work in an office and had a lot of free time at home. But he insisted on going to the library to write the book. Why? Because, even though his study at home was good, we subconsciously think of home as a place to rest and relax. The library is full of people who are studying seriously, so the motivation is stronger. This is the change that the environmental field brings to us. So if you feel that you lack motivation for something and cannot persist, try changing the environment. You may have a different result. Part 2. To become a better version of ourselves, we not only need to change our behavior, but also need effective internal thinking. Often, what hinders our progress is not our behavior but the rigid and inflexible thinking behind it. As mentioned earlier, changing behavior requires stepping out of our comfort zone and replacing old experiences with new ones. Similarly, changing our thinking requires replacing old thinking patterns with new ones. What kind of thinking patterns hinder our progress? This book mentions 3 typical types of thinking: rigid thinking, should thinking, and absolutist thinking. Let's look at each one. The first type is rigid thinking. People with rigid thinking have a typical characteristic of carrying a heavy burden of wanting to prove themselves. Their focus is not on doing things well, but rather on maintaining their image of being strong. For example, when facing a challenge, they are more likely to give up because they fear that the difficult task may expose their lack of ability. Or, they may think that if something can only be achieved through hard work, it is shameful and indicates their inadequacy. Although this kind of thinking protects their face and avoids anxiety, it also becomes an obstacle to moving forward. The second type is should thinking. For example, if someone has been slacking off lately, they might think, "I should buy some books to enrich myself," or "I should get a gym membership to exercise." However, it is often difficult to succeed when doing things with this kind of thinking. Why can't should thinking bring the desired change? The author says it's because should thinking is essentially an imitation. Simply put, the person doesn't really want to make an effort, but just wants to satisfy the idea that they should make an effort by putting on an effortful posture. The third type is absolutist thinking. There are three ways that absolutist thinking processes information: personalization, pervasiveness, and permanence. For example, if someone thinks that they will never love again after a breakup, that is personalization. Or, if someone thinks that if one crow is black, then all crows in the world are black, that is pervasiveness. Finally, if someone thinks that every bad thing that happens is either someone else's fault or their own fault, that is permanence. Once we adopt absolutist thinking, it is difficult for us to see hope for change. To become a better version of ourselves, we need more flexible ways of thinking. We need to replace old thinking patterns with new ones. How can we do that? If we compare the transformation of thinking to a river, then for a river to flow, it first needs the tension created by the difference between the source and destination, which is the motivation that comes from the gap between reality and goals. Second, controlling the direction of the river is essential, which is the method of doing things. Finally, it needs a continuous supply of fresh water from the source, which is the contact with reality. We won't go into the motivation aspect, as everyone has it. Next, we will focus on thinking patterns that can trigger effective behavior, and how to use these thinking patterns to turn motivation into action. This book mentions two particularly useful methods: the two halves of control and near thinking. First, let's talk about the two-part control method. As a psychotherapist, the author found that most people's problems stem from their attempts to control things they cannot control. Many things in life are beyond our control, such as our past and our living environment. Sometimes we don't want to admit that these things are beyond our control, so we have an expectation of how they should be. In a sense, should thinking is our obsession with things we can't control. Similarly, rigid and absolute thinking also focus our attention on what we can't control rather than on what we can control. The two-part control method tells us to focus on what we can control and not to try to control what we cannot control. It consists of two steps. First, think about what you can control and what you cannot control and shift your focus to what you can control. Second, identify what you can control and make a plan to do it well. For example, if you want to exercise, whether you can achieve your dream body is an unknown variable that no one can guarantee. This is something that is currently beyond your control. But you can control whether you get up early, take a walk in the neighborhood in the evening, and control your diet. Even if you can't exercise every day, you can at least exercise once a week. After identifying these controllable aspects, you can make a plan, such as what time to get up in the morning, what exercises to do, what kind of diet to follow, and work hard to do these things well. Although these may seem like trivial things that cannot change the outcome immediately, these controllable small things can help us focus on the present moment rather than worry about the future result. This is the first method, the two-part control method. Next, let's talk about the second method, called near thinking. What is near thinking? Near thinking focuses on what is real, happening now, and close at hand. Distant thinking, on the other hand, focuses on imagined, context-independent, and distant things. The book has an image metaphor that distant thinking is like watching TV, where we feel we can see things clearly, but those images are what the director wants us to see. Near thinking is more like being on the set of a movie, where there may be too many details to see everything, but we will see more and more real things. So how can we adopt a near thinking mindset? There are 3 principles that can help us. First principle, use descriptive language rather than evaluative language. What is descriptive language? It's a bit like camera language, where there is no evaluation, no adjectives, only verbs describing what is happening. For example, how do you transform evaluative language like this mother is very controlling and this daughter is very obedient into descriptive language? You can say the mother is pointing at her daughter and saying, "I do not allow you to do this." The daughter is bowing her head and remaining silent. This is descriptive language. It is vivid, rich, and full of possibilities for change. If you just say this mother is very controlling or this daughter is very obedient, there is little room for exploration, and it is difficult to bring about change. Second principle, ask specific questions rather than abstract questions. Abstract questions are often broad questions, like how can I overcome my shyness? Or how do I deal with procrastination? Specific questions should be I am very shy and get nervous when meeting people. What can I do? These kinds of questions can further stimulate thinking, such as which people make me nervous and which ones don't. In what situations do I get nervous in and what situations don't I? Only by observing what happens in the interaction can we discover the parts we can control and find possible ways out. Third principle, focus on what can be done now, rather than focusing on the results. Most people want to see it before they believe it. However, sometimes we need to believe and invest first before we can see what we want to see. If we always anticipate the results of our actions in our minds, we will lose the ability to act. Speaking of which, let's summarize briefly. You may have noticed that whether it's the small steps principle and behavior change or the two-part control and close thinking and mindset change, it seems to be emphasizing one thing. That's right, behavior and mindset are one and the same. No matter where you start or what method you use, the core and endpoint are all about emphasizing the present moment and focusing on the now. Part 3. All right. In the previous section, we discussed how to promote behavior change and also explored the thinking patterns behind behavior. These are all from an individual perspective. Next, let's take a different perspective and talk about how to become a better person from a broader relational perspective. This book says that we used to think it was our personality that influenced our thoughts and actions, but actually it's the relationships we are in that determine our thoughts and actions. For example, introverted people may feel shy and not know what to say when talking to strangers, but they can be very lively and talkative in front of familiar friends. Similarly, insecure people may underestimate themselves when doing things, but if someone in a certain relationship genuinely believes in them and appreciates them, they can become very confident. So you see, understanding oneself from a relational perspective has a great advantage over an individual perspective. You don't need to label yourself as sensitive and introverted or insecure or confident, but rather you can discover different aspects of yourself from different relationships and even seek out relationships that can help you perform better. Therefore, if we are dissatisfied with the current situation but cannot make changes, it is often not our personal problem but a problem with the relationships we are in. So, what kind of problems can arise in our relationships? In this book, the author lists many problems that can occur in relationships. Here, I will mention 2 scenarios that are particularly common in daily life. The first scenario is "it's all your fault." You are probably familiar with this sentence and have heard similar accusations many times. For example, some people say, "I have always said that when something happens, you should first look for the reason in yourself. If you don't listen, who do you blame?" The meaning behind this statement is, why can't you find the reason in yourself? It's all your fault. Similarly, some people may say, "I can change," as long as she becomes more gentle and considerate. The meaning behind this statement is also, because you haven't changed, I can't change. It's all your fault. We are all familiar with these scenarios, but many people are not so familiar with the underlying reasons behind them. What is the reason? In fact, as we mentioned earlier, it is because we are not looking at ourselves from a relational perspective, but from an individual perspective. The individual perspective is prone to causal thinking, which makes us think that someone's personality causes the problems in the relationship. For example, because the mother is controlling, both her husband and child have opinions about her. And this kind of causal thinking can also lead to right and wrong thinking, which means that everything is the mother's fault. However, the author says that people's behavior in relationships is mutually shaping, and there is no clear cause and effect, and no clear right and wrong. This kind of blame is actually passing the buck behavior, which is actually asking others to take responsibility for our feelings, and cleverly avoiding our own responsibilities and interpersonal relationships. If the responsibility is the other person's, then naturally we don't need to change anything. The second scenario is "it's all my fault." In contrast to "it's all your fault," "it's all my fault" is taking responsibility for others' feelings, taking on unnecessary burdens, and feeling guilty unnecessarily. This is actually taking the blame. This situation is very common, but many people are not aware of it. For example, during a psychology counseling salon attended by the author, a listener expressed their distress. "I have a friend who has been unhappy recently. I suspect they have depression. I have advised them many times, but they refuse to seek psychological counseling. As a friend, I feel very guilty watching them sink deeper into depression." Behind this statement is actually an expression of "it's all my fault. If only I had advised them better, they would have gone for counseling." So what is the root cause of "it's all my fault"? The reason is that, compared to enduring guilt and self-blame, we are more unwilling to admit that we are powerless in an important relationship. The feeling of powerlessness is unbearable. However, the author also reminds us that helping others without boundaries not only makes us sink into negative emotions, but can also damage our relationship. It's like 2 eggs, each with their own shell. No matter how much they want to get close to other eggs, they can only expect to become eggs in the same basket, rather than the same egg. If they get too close, it's easy for them to collide and break. Why are there so many interpersonal relationship problems in life? Through the 2 scenarios above, we can actually find a common reason, which is that most interpersonal relationship problems actually stem from not being able to distinguish between what is someone else's problem and what is our own. When people say it's all someone else's fault, they are actually pushing their responsibility onto someone else. While "it's all my fault" is the opposite, taking on someone else's responsibility and bearing unnecessary burden. One party always blames the other, while the other always feels it's their fault. In this kind of relationship, the two people are closely connected and torment each other. They want to break free, but can't change. So how can we establish a new, healthy relationship? The answer is obvious. Yes, it is to distinguish between what is someone else's problem and what is our own, which emotions belong to someone else, and which belong to us, and to establish healthy interpersonal boundaries. In psychology, there's a term for this method called separation of tasks. Separation of tasks is a theory proposed by psychologist Adler. It says that the key to solving interpersonal relationship problems is to distinguish between your tasks and my tasks, and then do each other's tasks well. How do you determine who is responsible for a task? It's actually very simple. It depends on who bears the direct consequences of the action. Whoever bears the direct consequences should be responsible. For example, the author says that the most common problem in counseling is the emotional entanglement between parents and adult children. Parents think that their children are still children, unable to manage themselves and not mature enough, so they worry about them everywhere, and sometimes do not want them to leave home. On the other hand, as adults, children feel that they have grown up and are mature enough, and they hope their parents understand this and let go. But they are also afraid of hurting their parents' feelings, worrying that they will be lonely, and thus unable to become independent. What can be done? At this time, you can try the separation of tasks method. For example, parents should see that their worries and reluctance are their own tasks, and cannot be used as a reason to prevent their children from becoming independent. Children should also see that leaving home is their own task, not their parents' task. They should strive for it themselves, rather than blame their parents for not letting them leave. Speaking of this, you may have this question. Is the end point of interpersonal relationships separation? Do we really have to draw boundaries with family and friends in order to become better? The author cites the views of family therapist Monica McGoldrick in her book You Can Go Home Again to answer this question. She said that only those who have left their families can choose to go home. Similarly, only when we are independent in a relationship can we truly and autonomously engage in a relationship with maturity. Separation is never the end point of interpersonal relationships. Separation is for better connection. You see, relationships are so magical. They can make us lose ourselves, but they can also help us find ourselves again. Perhaps only by letting go of our entanglement in relationships can we know what we truly want and make real changes. Alright, with that, we have finished interpreting the amazing me for you. Let's summarize briefly. At the beginning, we said that becoming a better self is like a hero's journey. On the road to improvement, you will encounter various hardships and setbacks. And today's book, The Amazing Me, is like a guardian that provides us with inspiration and guidance from different perspectives, including our outward behavior, inner thoughts, and relationships that influence our thoughts and actions. In terms of behavior change, the small steps principle helps us take the first step towards change, and the environmental cues help us solidify new experiences into lasting habits. In terms of thought change, the dual control and near thinking principles help us break free from rigid and absolute thinking. In terms of relationship change, the issue separation helps us distinguish between what is our own responsibility and what is others, reducing the burdens and constraints in interpersonal relationships. Finally, the author reminds us that we can view this book as a map of change, but it may only be a partial map with some unclear markings. However, as long as you have a map, you can begin your journey towards change. You can try to make changes, learn more about self-development based on the experiences in this book, and you may find that your own experiences are somewhat similar to what is described in this book, or maybe not. It doesn't matter, because the path you take is more important than the map. Good luck on embarking on your own hero's journey. Alright, that concludes the essential content of this book. Congratulations, you have finished listening to another book.